Good afternoon and welcome to the National Center on Intensive Interventions webinar, NCII 2.0, Lessons Learned from the First 5 Years of the Center. My name is Rebecca Zumeta-Edmonds and I am the Deputy Director of NCII and will be moderating today's webinar. Excuse me. So today we have a wonderful panel that will be joining us. We have Chris Lemons, who is the Senior Advisor to NCII and an Assistant Professor in the Department of Special Education at the Peabody College of Vanderbilt University. Kim Moore, who is a school psychologist and coach for the NCII project in the Columbia Public Schools. And we have Rod Teeple, who also serves in a similar role with the Grand Haven Public Schools in Grand Haven, Michigan. And he also serves as the MTSS coordinator for that district. And then we have Amy Peterson, who is our technical assistance liaison and who also coordinates all of our dissemination activities for the center, who will be talking a bit about the TA perspective on these lessons learned. Next slide. So the agenda for today's webinar is first to talk to you a bit about what we have learned from a number of different sources over the last 5 years of the project. We will be ending our first cycle of funding as of this Friday. And so we will start with a reporting from Chris Lemons about an in-depth set of interviews that we have done looking at the center and the lessons learned from talking to practitioners who have been implementing in several of the intensive TA sites where we've worked. We'll also get the perspective from folks who have worked as coaches in their districts about what implementation has looked like for them and what they've learned from the process, and then also from our technical assistance staff on the center. We will then talk a bit about what's next for NCII, and we are very fortunate to have another 5 years of grant funding starting next week. And so we have some new opportunities coming down the pike and wanted to make sure that our audience was aware of those and that we will be continuing to operate our website and provide resources to the field. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So as our panelists are presenting today, you are welcome to ask questions and just enter them into the chat box, and that will allow us to see your questions. We will stop periodically throughout the webinar in between presenters to address any questions that do come up during that period, and then we will also have some time for questions at the end. So please feel free to submit your questions through that chat box, and keep in mind that for this format, questions that are broadly applicable to the audience would be most useful. If you have questions specific to your context, we'd be happy to answer those through our mailbox. And with that, I'm going to turn over the first part of our webinar, which is going to talk a little bit, orient you a little bit to what the center's mission and work has been, excuse me, and also report on the findings from our lessons learned project that Chris Lemons has been leading. So with that, I'm going to turn the slides over to Chris, and thank you for participating.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'm Chris Lemons from Vanderbilt, and I'm very glad to be here. I serve as a senior advisor on this project, and so I'm going to provide a pretty quick overview of NCII and what we mean by intensive intervention, and then I'm going to get into the lessons that we've learned at many of our school sites, and I look forward to hearing from the other presenters who I think are going to offer some great contributions based on their experience in the schools. So first of all, the National Center on Intensive Intervention is a technical assistance center that is funded by OSEP, and as Rebecca said, they're entering their second phase of 5 years of funding. So the mission of the center is to really build capacity of local education agencies, practitioners, and other stakeholders to support the implementation of intensive intervention in both academics and behavior for students with severe and persistent learning and behavioral needs. I'm going to provide an overview of these basics, but if this is the first webinar that you've joined for NCII, I do suggest that you go back and look at some of the other webinars that are available, especially the one, An Introduction to Intensive Intervention, that was first aired on October 2012. So that would be a good starting point if you are just now kind of getting connected with this center. Nick, you can go to the next slide. So when we talk about intensive intervention, what we're talking about is a data-driven process to individualize and intensify academic and behavioral interventions for students who have the most significant needs. This diagram here is a flowchart that outlines the data-based individualization process that has kind of been the core of NCII's work. You can see that this process involves selecting an evidence-based program, a validated intervention program to start with, selecting some tools to monitor progress, and if you're not familiar with the tools charts that are available through the website, that would be a good place for you to select and learn more about validated interventions and tools to monitor progress in both academics and behavior. And then you can see we make some decisions about when students are responsive or non-responsive. And for students who are not responsive, we collect some additional diagnostic information to help us adapt the interventions that we started with, and that's an ongoing iterative process of basically trying to ensure that students do respond to the interventions that we're providing. And most of the time, intensive intervention is characterized by more intensity, so smaller group, more time, a more expertise instructor, and more closely matching the intervention to the student's needs. You can advance to the next one, Nick. So again, the approach that NCII is really focused on is data-based individualization, or DBI. And so this is really a systematic method for using data to determine when and how to provide more intensive intervention to students. And this really originated in the work of Standino and Merkin in 1977, looking at their initial ideas of data-based program modification or experimental teaching. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, it starts with an instructor selecting an evidence-based or research-validated program, and then using progress monitoring to determine when adaptations are going to be made to that program. And to learn more about DBI, if you go to the Intensive Intervention website under Implementation Support, there is a very detailed DBI training series that is very useful. And so if you would like to learn more information about the specifics of DBI, I encourage you to look at that resource. You can also look at an special issue of Teaching Exceptional Children that was published in 2014 that includes very in-depth examples of using DBI in reading, math, and behavior. Okay, next slide. So one of the questions that schools always ask is, well, who is intensive intervention for? Who are the students that you're talking about, and who is this appropriate for? So I think there are at least three groups of students that DBI is necessary for. So first of all, students with disabilities who are not making adequate progress in their current instructional program. Also, students who present with very low academic achievement and or high intensity and high frequency behavior problems. And these would typically be students with disabilities, but it may be students who have not yet been identified who just have persistent and severe academic and behavioral challenges. It is also appropriate for students who are in a tiered intervention system who have not responded to the secondary intervention programs delivered with fidelity. So the students typically who are moving into a tier 3 in an MTSS or RTI system. I do think it's important to note here that as this is an OSEP funded center, we really are focused on students with disabilities, and I think that school staff need to ensure that students with disabilities are receiving the most intensive academic and behavioral services in their school. So any school where students with disabilities are receiving less intensive services than those participating in the MTSS or RTI system, I think that should raise a red flag, and that schools should really consider whether they need to provide additional training to their special educators to implement a process like intensive intervention. Next slide. So NCII has done several different types of technical assistance activities. So they provided intense technical assistance to 26 schools and 12 districts in 4 different states. This technical assistance involved consultants going to the school and training, having a coach that interacted with the school staff over this period of time, and then having people like me, senior advisors, come in and do some observations and interviews at the end of each academic year. There were over 400 professional development events, and then the website represents a really great effort at disseminating universal technical assistance resources. And so the website has provided many webinars and training modules that are focused on intensive intervention. So if you haven't explored the website, I definitely encourage you to do it because it has some very valuable resources for schools. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little about some lessons learned. You can actually go to the next slide as well, Nick. So what we've done and kind of the points that I'm going to share next is at the end of every year, we do what is called a pulse check, where someone kind of familiar with the school and then someone who is less familiar with that school goes to the school and meets with administrators and teachers and really tries to determine what are the successes that are happening at that campus and what are some of the challenges. And the challenges helped inform the development of technical assistance in the next academic year. And what we've done for this paper is as we've kind of come to the end of the 5-year cycle, we conducted some additional follow-up interviews with practitioners and leadership in the school to really see if we could come up with some themes of lessons that were learned that might be useful for schools who are considering implementing intensive intervention in the future. And so we've interviewed the people at the schools, and then we also reviewed the pulse check data that was collected over time, and we've kind of just done really a qualitative synthesis to look at what are some of the themes that we discovered. And so working on a manuscript that's going to be providing a little more detail on these themes. I'm going to give you a little preview of that today, and that will be available soon on the NCII website. Okay, so lesson number 1. So Nick, you can change the slide. So one of the first things that many schools focused on is that planning for implementation is critical, as you can imagine. And so schools, personnel at schools really thought that starting small and moving forward one step at a time was a strategy that would really ensure success, and that administrators expressed that it was really better to have some initial successes than to overcommit and end up frustrated, and that planning needs to take into account realistic challenges that are occurring at the schools. And so in some of our schools, the administrators were very gung-ho and decided to kind of jump fully in. And in those schools, they really had many more challenges with implementation because they were trying to do too much at once. And so the schools that really decided to implement in a much smaller way tended to see that as a pathway to success. And so a couple of quotes that I have from a school psychologist who was leading a DBI team at her campus said, "You've really got to trust the process, and to start with being very reflective and very honest about where you are as a building. And we had to start small and build that foundation first." So this school psychologist really felt that one of their keys to success was critically analyzing where they were, being honest about some of the challenges that they had in that building, and trying to address them one at a time in a slow, systematic process. And so that's really one of the first lessons that I think was learned across these schools. Okay, lesson number 2, Nick. So this lesson, many school administrators thought that really rolling things out in a linear fashion had some advantages and really made things make sense. So schools that really were able to connect the implementation of DBI or intensive intervention to their broader RTI or MTSS systems seemed to feel that provided more opportunities for success, and that school staff had a better idea of how students might move into intensive intervention and back out of intensive intervention. I do think it's important to note that schools expressed that they couldn't wait to implement DBI until tiers 1 and 2 were perfect, but that the more solid those foundations were, the easier it was to implement RTI or DBI. So I think what's important here is that this is kind of a balancing question. So the more you can have a firm foundation, the more likely you are to be successful with DBI. But I do think if there are schools where students with disabilities are not receiving very intensive services, it's also not fair to those students to deny intensive intervention until the RTI system has worked itself out. So although schools did express that it was easier when those foundations were in place, I do think it's important to realize that you can't wait to start implementing with kids who really need these services until everything is worked out. Okay, lesson 3, Nick. Okay, as with most school change projects, we know that leadership is very, very important. And so in the schools that had successes, they felt that strong administrator support from both general and special education was really important, and that this support needed and campus level. I think it's important to state that at the campus level, this doesn't necessarily have to be the principal. We saw in many schools that there were other people, like an MTSS coordinator or a school psychologist, that played the role of the campus leadership. So it doesn't always have to fall on the principal to do this. There were some challenges in schools where there was only only campus leadership involved and not as much district leadership. And in those places, I think it was just harder for the schools to connect the DBI process with the broader MTSS or RTI system that was occurring in the school. So it seemed to be a good facilitator to have district support as well. And then that leadership support really helps ensure that DBI is connected or embedded in kind of the broader initiatives that are going on at the school. And a couple of quotes from an administrator. And I think this is a nice quote from a director of student services in one of the districts. She says, "Get ready because it is hard work. Don't think there is anything in this process that does not change your intellect and professional knowledge. You need a level of commitment that even when it gets difficult, you will not sacrifice the time you've set aside or the direction that you've given in terms of implementation of intervention. This has to be a priority. The administrator has to be able and willing to commit services or commit resources in order to be able to maintain fidelity of the plan." That's my word of advice. So this administrator really kind of recognized that the best way to get school staff to buy into this process and to commit to the challenge is to have a district level administrator who was committed to the process, and that she felt that her role was really one of the things that really facilitated success in her district. Okay, lesson 4. So lesson 4 is really about thinking about the processes and protocols that are taking place and being used in the schools. And so school staff felt that strong standard programs and clear procedures really helped sites focus more time on students' response to intervention and problem solving, and that it basically facilitated more discussions about instruction and adapting that instruction. And the school staff established, in the successful schools, they established protocols, so like scripted meeting agendas, and really tried to systematize procedures to help when there was staff turnover. So one of the challenges, in almost all school initiatives is that teachers and staff change over time, and that if you're consistently having to kind of reinvent the wheel or retrain someone, it really can limit your successes. And so the schools that expressed successes with you implementing protocols, basically what they tried to do is ensure that even if teachers were changing, the same discussions would be occurring in meetings. There were clear procedures for when students moved to intensive intervention or when an adaptation was made, and that the more that those sessions can be systematized, the more those decisions can be systematized, the more likely they are to maintain even with school or staff turnover. Okay, lesson number 5. So the final lesson that we're highlighting on this webinar today is the need to trust the process. So in every district that we worked, one of the things we consistently heard that is the implementation is hard work, and it requires commitment, and oftentimes creative thinking about staffing, scheduling, determining who's going to keep up with data, who's going to keep up with decisions. But the schools that had success really felt like it was their commitment to implementing the process that really got them through kind of the bumpy parts. And so most of the schools indicated that really there has to be a commitment to not giving up, even though there are definitely going to be times that it's challenging. So I have another quote from an MTSS coordinator that I really enjoyed this quote, that database decision making is not for wimps. You really got to go in knowing that it's hard work, and once you've made that commitment, you can't just give up. And so I think that the schools that realized there are going to be some challenges, it's going to be a little bit messy, we're going to learn along the way, but they committed to improving and learning along the way, they felt that they had the most successes with implementing the DBI process and integrating it into their systems. So those are the kind of summaries of the lessons learned that I have. Again, this will be provided in more detail in a manuscript that will be available soon on the Intensive Intervention Network. And I look forward to any questions that you have, and I definitely look forward to hearing from the next presenters who have been out in the schools.
Thank you very much, Chris. As a reminder to our participants, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the question or the chat box. So far, we have not received any questions, but that line is open if anything does come up, and we will also have a chance to hear from Chris again in terms of responding to questions at the end of the webinar if things come to mind. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Kim, who will be talking a bit about her perspective in doing this work as a district coach.
Okay. Hello, can everyone hear me? I'm going to say yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Okay, yeah, I became a coach actually the third year of this 5-year project, and so I helped support 2 elementary schools that came on board in the beginning of this NCII project and already had training. And then in my last year, we also added a middle school to our project. And so what you see on your screen are some sample demographics of these demographics are pretty accurate in terms of one of my 2 elementary schools as well as the middle school. So you can see that these 2 schools presented with a lot of challenges in terms of how we could provide academic and behavioral support for a fairly high number of struggling students. My other elementary school was a little less diverse and a little more sort of middle of the road. They didn't have quite such a high mobility rate. They didn't really have any ELL students in that building, and they had significantly less students who had received free and reduced lunch. So because of that, then they were not actually a Title I school, whereas my other elementary school was a Title I school. Next slide, please. So my coaching role was really just to support the ongoing training that the school teams in my 2 elementary schools had already received before. And I just did typically would do just a little bit of mini follow-up training as needed. Also helped provide the school teams with resources, resources for good instructional materials or other things like that. And oftentimes it was really just a matter of redirecting them back to the NCII website where a lot of these great resources reside. And then also providing them assistance with data analysis. And so that was pretty easy to do. I definitely also, one of my key roles was to help them, especially in the beginning when they were looking at their data in their data team meetings and when they were trying to do those individualized problem-solving plans. All of my schools used the NCII forms that are provided as example forms when you're trying to do an individualized problem-solving process, and those were so helpful. Again, we had roles assigned, we had definitely a nice structure to our meeting format, so we were able to do those meetings in a pretty efficient manner. In, I think, all three of my schools, we made some slight tweaks to the forms just to make them more applicable to the school environment, but for the most part we used those forms and found those to be really helpful in setting that up. Another thing that we found really helpful in all of my schools was we needed to make those plans available to all of the teachers who would be potentially implementing the plan or needed to know about the plan. In our district, we used Google Docs as a way to share out that individual plan so that teachers and administrators could have easy access to it. And then the other really key part of what we found to be a good lesson learned was that we really needed to set regular follow-up meetings, and really to do that follow-up meeting, to set that at the end of that initial problem-solving meeting so that we didn't forget to go back and review the data and review the student progress in a timely fashion. Next slide. So as it's already been pointed out, leadership is absolutely critical, and I was very fortunate that all of the principals in this project were very supportive and active leaders in the process. And also in all three of my schools, the school psychologist took a lead on, especially on the data gathering and data analysis part. That's really important in making sure that we know how students are doing when we put these interventions in place. The other really key thing that we tried to do in my buildings was to ensure that our special educators were part of those meetings, part of those data team reflection meetings, even when it didn't involve children already on their caseload, because we wanted this to be sort of a seamless process of students who need intervention get intervention, and we don't really have to worry so much about the label. Down the road, many of these students, if the interventions needed to be more and more intensive, might become special education students, but we wanted to build their participation in, and so we did, and we made that a priority. It was not always easy, but we did it. In terms of rigor and fidelity, we really worked to be certain that those kids that we put into our Tier 3 groups and or that we gave those individualized learning plans to, that those teams were meeting on a regular basis, those interventions were happening on a regular basis, and that they were using evidence-based practices in working with those students. And it's already been talked about staff turnover. That was always a challenge, and we always tried to sort of plan for that at the beginning of the school year, not only in training new staff to the building, but also it was kind of important to do a refresher with existing staff just to get them back in the mode of kind of thinking in this new DBI way. Okay, next slide. So in terms of looking at our overall school-wide data, we saw very different results in my two elementary schools. One of the elementary schools, the one that I mentioned, is more rural. We saw screening data that looked really pretty much like the pyramid you would want to see. And so we had just a pretty small number of students who fell into that Tier 3 category. And that was pretty manageable and easy to plan for in terms of implementing those Tier 3 small group interventions, and also developing those individualized plans for students who were not successful in those interventions. My other school, however, the one that we showed you the demographics earlier on this slide, that was a little more challenging. They didn't have the perfect pyramid. Instead, they had more of a almost an inverted pyramid. It was definitely a situation where we had a significant number of students in our Tier 3 group when we looked at that initial screening data. And so that became very challenging, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how we kind of creatively solved that issue. The other lesson learned, I'd say, was that we definitely needed to build in grade level data review meetings on a very regular basis, and it was most beneficial if we built those into the school calendar at the beginning of the year so that those meetings did happen with regularity and they didn't get kind of pushed to the side in the madness of the middle of the year rush. So that would be another kind of pointer I would say would be really helpful as you're going into this process. And the other thing we did was we only started with one area in the beginning. We really only started with our reading data and looked at trying to do intensive intervention in the area of reading. Okay, next slide. So creative grouping. At my school, where we had this large number of Tier 3 students based on our initial screening data, we really had a challenge in terms of how we could possibly support all of those students, because we know for a successful Tier 3 group, you need to keep the group size and it needs to be cohesive. All the students need to have similar needs, and that became really difficult. So next slide, please. So what we did in this particular school, we first of all grouped our students, and I show you the things that we used to help make those initial groupings. And what we found out is that almost every grade level we had significant number of Tier 3 students. And so talking this school that had about a little over 500 students in the school, and so at every grade level we would have somewhere between 15 and 18 students who were clearly Tier 3 students. Some of them identified already with IEPs, but many of them not. And so we were trying to brainstorm what we could possibly do. Our principal kind of came up with this great idea, and her great idea was, because traditionally the classroom teacher teaches her 90-minute block of reading instruction, and then we would take part of that 90-minute block and pull out and do like a 20 to 30-minute intervention time. And so we kind of decided collectively with her support that these kids really needed more intensity than that. And so we completely did grouping of the entire 90-minute reading instructional block for all of our students. And so the other thing that they did at this school was we combined 4th and 5th grade together, and then we combined 2nd and 3rd grade together for instruction, so that we could also do some cross-grade grouping if that seemed appropriate for a particular student. Now, as you can imagine, that was sort of a scheduling nightmare, but we worked it out and set it up that way so that 4th and 5th grade had their reading instruction at the same time of the day, and 2nd and 3rd grade did likewise. And then the other really important thing that we did, especially, and we sort of kept refining our process each year, but by the 2nd year we definitely, in those Tier 3 groups, which I remember consisted of like sometimes 15 to 18 students, we definitely made sure that we had our very best reading teachers in teaching those students. We made sure that the students were getting an evidence-based intervention for sure, and also supplemental evidence-based instructional approaches were happening with them. So in order to make that group work, we backfilled that 90-minute block with at least 2 supplemental teachers. And because this building had, of course, special education teachers, English language learner teachers, we actually had 2 of them. We had so many ELL students, and then Title I reading teachers, we were able at each grade level, starting with 1st grade, to add 2 teachers to that entire 90-minute block. So during that 90-minute block, those struggling readers actually got small group, pretty intense dosage of reading with all 3 teachers And so, like one teacher for maybe 30 minutes would be doing a Wilson's lesson, a second teacher in the same classroom would be doing another small group, maybe a skills-based lesson, and then the third teacher would maybe be doing like a reading comprehension lesson or something, and they would switch off. And so it I would say the biggest kind of takeaway from that, not only did we see some really great results, great improvements in student reading outcomes by the end of the year, but we also saw a lot of teacher satisfaction. Teachers really felt like kids were being supported appropriately instructionally and were making great progress, and the teachers felt supported in the process. So, next slide. Another thing that happened in our schools were already strong PBIS schools, and they already had some great Tier 2 interventions set up, especially in the 2 elementary schools. They had a nice systematic check-in, check-out process for some of those Tier 2 struggling kids. But we also were lucky enough to receive some outside support from a supplemental coach through some mental health dollars we had in our community. And what we found between the combination of having this coaching support that could come in and help do some individualized behavioral plans with some of those high flyer discipline kids, that plus the combination of changing up how we taught reading to those struggling readers, just within 1 year's time, we significantly reduced the number of office discipline referrals in the school. So we really felt like it was that combination of giving kids instruction at their appropriate level, plus having really good systematic behavioral supports in place for those most struggling students that really made a huge impact in that. Okay, next slide. And then the very last year of our project, so just basically last year, we added a middle school to our project, and definitely there were some differences in working with the middle school. You certainly could not do any kind of real school-wide planning. They worked as grade level teams, and in our middle school's case, there were actually 2 distinct grade level teams per grade level. It was a 6, 7, 8 middle school model. And so rather than doing any kind of school-wide thing, we had to just work with the grade level teams in terms of how we would do this work. And so we really did focus just on developing individual student plans for the most part. There were a few times where we actually did create sort of grade level wide plans that when we saw several students having the same issue, but for the most part we were focusing on really working with those most struggling students. And how did we identify those students? What data did we use? Actually, we just used a lot of data that we had on hand that maybe people don't think about, but we had the data, and so we took that data and we used we have in our district we use STAR reading and math, so we as our benchmark measure for students. So we took their fall STAR reading and math scores as one of our district data. We looked at the number of office discipline referrals the student had received the previous year. We looked at their attendance from the previous year, and we also looked at the number of D's and F's they had received in the previous year. And we used sort of that whole combination of data to determine who our top 8 to 12 high flyers were on each grade level team. We then took those names to the teachers on the team and let them choose who they wanted to start problem solving on first. And so we sort of went from there. And in almost every case, we our data team meetings twice a month, and we would start with one student, and then we would work on the next student the next time, and then we would build in checks of progress along the way. And that seemed to work out really well for them. Really by the end of the year, we had some of our school teams that were functioning pretty well independently without me having to support them, or be the leader of the team. So that was really great. So that's kind of how we did it at the middle school. And then the last slide, I think, we can change. Okay. So some of the kind of differences at the middle school to keep in mind is that we did have, in this particular middle school, they did have sort of an RTI time intervention block built into some of the student schedules, not all of them. But what we found was there was really no expectations about what was supposed to happen during that RTI time. There was really not a lot of guidance given to the teachers who were teaching during that intervention block what they were supposed to be doing. And so sometimes kids were not always grouped appropriately for the intervention block. And so that's a barrier that the school's continuing to work on kind of this year. And then the other thing that we found that when we were trying to develop individual student plans, especially when we were talking about behavioral types of plans, we had to be really careful that we made sure that everyone was sort of on the same team, that we all were doing the same thing. So it was fairly easy for the core academic teachers to implement the plan, whether that was, making sure the student got to class on time or making sure they were doing their work during the class period. But we also had to impart that knowledge to like their electives teachers, for example. So lots of little differences in the middle school, less able to control for some of those things, but there are ways around it. You just have to kind of work smarter. So I think that's everything, unless there's some questions about what I've presented.
Hi, Kim. There was a couple of questions that came in before you around.
Amy, I'm sorry. I was muted. I didn't realize that I've been talking. Sorry about that, everyone. So there were a couple questions that came in for Kim, and then a couple that were more general for the entire panel. So I'll start with the questions that were targeted toward Kim. First was from Barbara, and she's asking, was the class Kim is describing, the 90 minutes of intervention, considered their core ELA class, or was it in addition to the core class?
No, that was their core reading, writing class.
Okay.
No, I would say that was their core reading instructional class. They also had another hour of writing later on in the day, but that was their core reading.
Okay. And how about a question from Rebecca is, were the intervention groups done within this classroom, or was this a separate literacy block? So I guess basically the same question. I should have read that one ahead of time, but it was a similar question. So sounds like for the most part this was done as the core reading time with some supplementation or some additional time for writing done separately.
Right. And one thing that I could add to that I didn't before was not only did our intervention teachers love it because they saw so much more progress with their lower readers, but actually our teachers who had the Tier 2 students, as well as our teachers that had the Tier 1, or we called some of them Tier 1 plus, our accelerated readers, they loved it too because they could do more extension type of reading activities with those higher readers, and really just target instruction so much more easily without having to sort of wait for the rest of the, be there to try to teach to all levels at one time. So it was really a win-win, I think, for all of the students in the school. And with that high mobility rate and just the high number of students that were struggling, it just is what made sense. And so the school is continuing to do it because they really like this model.
Okay, great, thanks. And then this is a question that's probably for more generally for the panelists. So Kim, please jump in, but others, Rod or Chris, also feel free to jump in. Do you have a recommendation for an MTSS job description? One that has maybe where 100% of the person's time would be devoted to data and administration, or even one where maybe half the time was with students and half the time was working with MTSS. Any thoughts on that?
This is Rod here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I guess my thought on that is it depends a lot on how things are organized within the district and how big the job is. So, for example, I coordinate 7 elementary buildings, and I'm only 0.5 doing that. So, for me to take time out of that and actually work individually with students as part of that job, I don't know how I would manage to do that. But I've also heard of people that, like, within one building might be coordinating MTSS at the building level, and working with students would be a significant part of the job. So I think it matters a lot on kind of what you're looking for. They may actually be doing some of the intervention as well as coordinating.
Mm-hmm. And given your role, Rod, what kind of expertise would you put into a job description like that?
Well, obviously I think the data part is really important, and being able to work with teams and work with adults. I think to me that's the bigger trick of it, is kind of getting people to do what you're asking them to do, and to see the value in what you're doing and give it a try, even though it may not be their most comfortable thing to be working on. That's
a very good point. And then we have 2 more questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to hold those toward the end, because again, they're more general questions. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rod Teeple now, who's from the Grand Haven, Michigan schools, and he's going to talk a bit about their experience.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. Well, hello from Michigan. We really do appreciate all the work and the support that the center has provided us over the last 5 years, and we're just really gotten top-notch coaching and just really good technical assistance from the group. So we've been really pleased to be part of the project. Nick, if you go to the next slide. Really kind of telling a little bit about myself and the district. We're really very fortunate in that we have some support, some time to sort of put away for MTSS. And so in Grand Haven, we have about 6,000 students total. We have 7 elementary buildings that have all very separate, kind of distinct personalities as neighborhood schools. One of our principals even likes to say that they're more like 7 districts all on their own. So they're really kind of unique that way. But for this project, we focus a lot on very elementary school, is our emphasis being on behavior with them. And so when we started back in, I think it was the spring of 2012, one of the first things that we did after we had sort of the initial introduction to NCII was to recognize that we really needed to retool our PBIS system at the Tier 1, because we just had a really high number of kids that were looking like Tier 3 kids, and it was a lot to try to even start to wrap our heads around doing the DBI process, just because there's a lot of sort of time intensive to do with kids. So what we did was we worked very hard on overhauling and completely just sort of reinventing PBIS at that building. And at the end of a couple of years, what we saw was that we still had more ODRs, office disciplinary referrals, really than any other building in the district. And if you look at the slide, you'll see we only have 285 students. So we're kind of like a nice little slice of Grand Haven. But we're different from the rest of the district in that many of our buildings don't have nearly the amount of free and reduced lunch that we have, or some of those difficulties that we know intervene in the lives of kids and cause them to have difficulty. So in 2014 and 2015, we began to focus more systematically on Tier 2, thinking that when we looked at those numbers, we were really trying to tighten up check-in, check-out as a procedure, and trying to add some fidelity to it. What we saw when we looked at our numbers of ODRs was that really about a third of that entire count of them was accounted for by just a handful of students. So we were trying to invent some ways that we could work with those kids in a meaningful way and help them to improve their behavior and again, reduce the number of kids that would have to go on to Tier 3. And what we determined at that point was that we had a little bit of success with that, but things were kind of all over the board with Tier 2 even after a year of focusing on it. So what do I mean by all over the board? What we saw was that if you're familiar with the check-in, check-out intervention, the idea is that we have an adult mentor who checks in with a student in the morning and gives them a behavior rating card. Their teacher fills that behavior rating card out throughout the day, and then that child takes the card back to that adult mentor at the end of the day and checks them out, and they talk about it and set some goals and get ready for the next day to kind of talk about what they need to do better, or if they're doing well, what they can continue to do. And what we found was that we had some students that were only getting sort of that mentorship, so they'd check in with somebody at the beginning of the day, check out at the end, but there was no behavior rating card, and yet that was being called check-in, check-out. We found some students who were really just carrying around a behavior rating card, but they really didn't have an adult mentor that was kind of supervising and helping them and rooting for them and developing that relationship. And so what we really wanted to do was to improve the fidelity of that with the idea that again, we could get the number of kids that we really wanted to move on to Tier 3, making that more of a manageable number for us. So if we look at the next slide, we were asked to take a little sort of a look back before that. What was Ferry Elementary School like before NCII came around? And at that time, we were using a child study system to manage all of the behavior interventions. And so those were meetings with a lot of professionals. So you might call them different things in your building. Nick, can you go on to the next slide? Maybe my computer froze up. Oh, there it is. So we had a lot of professionals that were involved in those child study meetings. So we had a school psychologist, the speech and language pathologist would come to everyone, school social worker, the resource teacher, the reading specialist, and then as well as the principal and the classroom teacher. And so with all those people in the room, it often became sort of seen as like the road to special education or the way to get a special ed referral. But the system was being overwhelmed by too many students that behaviorally in particular hadn't even had some very low-level kinds of interventions. And so with those numbers, the focus oftentimes was just on trying to get every student that there'd been a request on to at least have one meeting during the year. There wasn't a lot of time left over to go back and intensify interventions or to work with fidelity or to move systematically between Tier 2 and Tier 3. And so as a result, we had a lot of recommendations that came out of that team that were kind of based on a small menu of medium intensity interventions. So we really weren't getting to what we wanted to happen in Tier 3, and as we've been working with NCII and had some really good trainings on the idea of getting some functional behavior assessment as part of what we did, and then from that, developing a more formal behavior intervention plan. Those things were kind of rare, and often they were seen as the last resort. Almost, people looked at them almost as a hoop to jump through right before maybe students went to a more restrictive kind of a special education setting or different special ed room that might take up more of their day. So we really were trying to manage to get around that. So the next slide really looks at kind of what happened after we came to be part of NCII. And so especially a lot of this occurred just during last school year, during 2015, 2016. We were able to take some of that pressure off the child study team, mainly by developing a behavior team that met and managed Tier 2 and made decisions about moving students on to Tier 3. So this was kind of a parallel team that we put in place. It was parallel to child study. It also was parallel to our grade level meetings that were going on and focusing very well on academics. We'd always kind of had this dream of having that grade level team with that were meeting every 6 weeks, focus on some behavior as well. But we just hadn't gotten. We always were busy with reading and math and didn't have time to get into behavior with those. So we didn't have that specific focus. So one thing that we talked a little bit about, and we were glad that we were able to do in many ways, was we had the behavior team that we developed have many of the same members that were also on the grade level teams or on the child study team. And so that way, even though it was somewhat parallel, it wasn't completely in isolation. And what we were trying to do is that idea that a lot of behavior problems are rooted in academic deficits, and sometimes academic deficits are developing because kids are having behavior problems and are out of the classroom. And so what we wanted to do was try to develop a system where we could just take care of those things in a unified way, but having some separate teams that focus on sort of individual pieces of the puzzle so that they could really get in and try to focus on moving interventions to more intensive levels. So one thing that really helped us too is that NCII was essentially relentless on having us develop some written guidelines so that we could answer a couple of simple questions. Those were things like, is the intervention that we're doing working? Is it not working? And what should we do next? And we found those things to be very, very critical when it came to those meeting times when we had kids that, for a variety of reasons, and we can talk about those a little bit in a second, maybe people didn't want to move them up the tier, or sometimes wanted to move them down a tier. And so it was nice to have something that was written and that we developed that we could focus on. And of course, trying to just keep records of that and accountability. Those are things that we've developed too, and that those have been really successful for us. So Nick, if we go to the next slide, one thing that we found that made a really big difference for us was to focus on data that was beyond just the office disciplinary referrals. So we added data from those daily report cards that were part of the check-in, check-out intervention. And that gave us something that we could graph, that we could look at for changes from day to day. And it also gave us some insight into what the student was doing well, rather than just focusing on when they were, when they were getting caught doing the wrong thing. So it gave us a lot of things to work with for students in that way. And those were invaluable for coming up with the extensions and the modifications to the child's intervention. So another important lesson that we learned was that we had to make sure that we weren't operating, again, in isolation like we talked about. That shared staff really helped us look at the academic needs and make sure that we were trying to address those in various ways. So what I always felt like it was sort of like if we were looking at it in different pieces, then the behavior team was a little bit freed up to focus on some behavioral strategies and interventions, knowing that the academic part was being taken care of by a different team that managed the interventions in reading, for example, that provided the interventions in reading, monitored those, made decisions about moving kids up those tiers, because we were doing pretty well in that area. It was in the behavior that we were having more difficulty with. So Nick, if we can move on to the next slide. So what were some of the lessons that we learned? I think they were very similar to the ones that we've been talking about all afternoon. So staff development was really important as we tackled these changes. What we found was that the team itself had to understand what they were doing and why they were doing it before they could really successfully communicate that to the teachers and to the other staff and do that in a really meaningful way to staff. What we found was that gaining trust in the system from everyone was difficult. For some teachers, it still didn't feel like it moved quickly enough for them. And so we found that within staff development, one thing that was a good avenue for us was to approach from both sides of the issue, so we could get information to the staff, but we were also working on getting feedback back from the staff so that we could kind of modify our approach and modify how we were communicating to various different stakeholders in the building to make sure that we were moving in a positive light with that. Go on to the next lesson that we learned, and that was that meetings are critical. So that was really one of the biggest things that we learned. I think a lot of times, especially in smaller buildings like this one, we have 285 students or so. So they're small. There's only a couple of teachers at each grade level. In fact, some grade levels even only had one teacher, I think, part of the time that we were working with this. And what we found is that being small breeds a lot of that sort of informality. So instead of sitting down and having a formal meeting, people just want to kind of talk in the hall or talk over lunch and make some quick decisions that way. And so what we found is as we tried early in the first few years to be more systematic with the meeting part, we often hit kind of rough water because meetings were being postponed, or sometimes they didn't have the right staff members there present to be part of it. And for me, that became really clear just a couple of years ago when one of our external coaches from NCII, we're in Grand Haven, Michigan, so we're along the shore of Lake Michigan. A good part of our district bumps right up against the water, so it's a nice place to visit. But we had a coach coming from Chicago, which is about a 3 or 4 hour drive. And so at the last minute, our coach had to cancel her attendance at one of those behavior team meetings. And I was already at the lobby at the school, and the weather wasn't great, but I'd made it over from another building because I didn't have that far to go. And I was in the lobby of the school waiting for some other meetings to get over. And then the building staff just decided, oh, well, if we weren't having the coach from Chicago, then why should we have this meeting? And they canceled the entire behavior meeting for that month. To me, that was a really important message about the why that they were having those meetings for at that time. And it clued me in on what we really needed to focus on. So the following year after that, so this last school year, we changed that. And the first ground rule on the floor was that we'll set a meeting schedule from the beginning of the year, and we'll adhere to it no matter what, no matter who's there. We never got down to the point of only 1 or 2 people there. We always had pretty good attendance, and we were able to have teachers rotate, and we even worked with our scheduling to make them able to do that more conveniently. We were meeting before school hours, and so we at least were able to give them a little bit of a schedule so they knew when to arrive and what portion of their time before they got ready for students to be coming in that they'd be meeting with us. So the meeting part was critical, and it really did turn things from formal, somewhat less database to really creating this little arena where we could sit down, look at the data, look at the decision-making rules, apply those together, and then make some decisions about kids that wound up making sense for them. So if we can go to the next slide, Nick. So that whole idea of data and having the process were really, really important to us. One thing we had to do was to help to show that the data lines up with that teacher perception of what I'll air quote it, what the real world experiences that they're seeing on a day-to-day basis. And what we found is that the more they felt the data didn't match their real world viewpoint, then the more they tended to be a little more challenging of what we were doing, the decisions we were making, and so forth. Another thing that we found that was really important was to have that process just be easy. So the data had to be easy to collect, the graphs had to be easy to make, and then easy to understand. So we went through a variety of different formats. We had a school psychologist in the building that really was good with Excel and was good with Google Sheets for a while. And so we had some various ways of organizing data within those, but they were so complicated that really we only had one person that could even understand kind of how the graphs were made and how to get what we needed. And that system didn't work very well. So we went back to a graphing program that's been around for years and years, but it was easy to understand, and that seemed to make all the difference. We could just put it in a little portion of a shared drive, and it was easy to put data in, and it was easy just to pull one button up and look at student graphs on each student, and that really made all the difference. We also found that the rules for moving students through the tiers had to be pretty simple. So even though there's a lot of weight and thought that went into why we developed those rules, in previous years we had rules that had kind of a lot of if-and statements and a lot of contingencies that if they do this but not that but the other thing. And so we really made them pretty clear. And for us, what it finally amounted to was that we wanted to see some kind of progress on their daily point sheet. So even if they weren't at sort of that mythical 80% of their points for the day, we still felt like we were successful if they were making progress toward that 80%, or we're hovering somewhere around that 80%. And then we set this idea that we didn't want more than 2 ODRs in any 1 month. That was the rule. And what we found was that we wanted to be able to give children the idea that, you know, we don't expect them to be perfect. We know they've had difficulties. That's how they wound up on Tier 2, or they wound up in Tier 3. But we also didn't want to give this sort of open blank check to have as many ODRs as they wanted. So 2 ODRs seemed like it worked for us pretty well in a month. It identified the kids that really were struggling. Now, even with a simple rule like that, what we found was there were people that wanted to challenge, and they wanted to kind of look for loopholes. So I remember the question, well, okay, what if it's the 30th of the month, and this student has an ODR on the 30th, and then a couple days later it's the 1st of the next month, and now he has an ODR again. So that's technically 2 ODRs, but they happen in 2 different months. So how do we apply the rule? And number one, what we found is that only happened maybe once in the whole year, and we figured out what to do because that student also had had more than just 1 ODR in either of the 2 months around it. So it was really kind of an isolated case that we would have a student that only had an ODR, 1 in each month, and yet we're within like 4 days or 30 days of each other. So, but we found, again, trying to make those rules simple, we still had people kind of wanting to challenge them and asking things about them. But it did work well for us, and it would limit the way that we looked at kids down to a very simple method. One of the other things that we worked really hard to simplify was just the way that we kept records and documented. And what we found was that having some kind of redundancy was actually a really good thing. So the record keeping had to be really practical. So we found that it just made sense to have 2 separate systems, because on one system we wanted to track an individual child, have a sort of an artifact for that child that at the end of the year we could put it into their permanent folder. It would become part of their, their permanent record. But it would allow students, because we have a little bit of transiency in a building with 65% or so free and reduced lunch. We also have a good number of kids that move in and move out during the course of the school year. So it gave us a way that we could track that and put that into a file before a child moved, or put it in the file at the end of the year, so that we had some way of keeping track for others that might work with that student, or for ourselves when we came back the next year. So we found that was really important. But then the other thing that kind of emerged from that was that it really would have been nice, and we figured out a way to do it, but we realized it would be very nice to have a system to keep track of kids in a way that that allowed us to look at everybody all together. So what we found worked best for us was kind of a combination. We had some electronic records where we kept those individual sheets, and at the end of the year, or if a student was moving before their file was mailed out, we could just print that and put it in the file. But we also had just some good old-fashioned pencil and paper kind of a worksheet that we put together, and it became the agenda for each meeting. And it just had the students that we were working with, how many ODRs they'd had, what percentage of their points they'd gotten for that time period, overall, kind of what the trend was. Were they trending up or down or staying the same? But then at a glance, we could kind of look at the work of that team. And we found that that was really important too, because the team had to be able to look and say, you know what, even though some of these kids, when you're kind of in the weeds, it feels like we're not making so much success with those individual students, we could look at the big picture and say, but you know what, here's 3 kids that really have done so well they don't even need Tier 3 interventions anymore. Here's a couple of kids that we did need to move up, and here's a couple that are maintaining. So it just allowed us to be more, I think, accountable to ourselves and look to how the team was functioning, how things were going that way. And so we kept that pencil and paper stuff in a binder, and at the end of the year we even printed the electronic things we had and put those in binders. So it's sort of old-fashioned, but it worked for the team that we had, and we have a few different members, I think, on that team this year. So I'm sure that as the course of the year goes on, they may modify that again. But hopefully they can keep up with those 2 main kinds of data that we were collecting, because those are really important. And then the last slide, there was a question about kind of tough barriers and things that we either overcame or in some ways are still working to overcome. And one of the big ones of those, I think, is just dealing with the belief system. And what we found is that when we talk about behaviorally based interventions, and we're talking about rewards and sometimes response cost and how kids are moving through that kind of a system, there's some people that have really strong feelings one way or the other. And what we were surprised was that was actually true both for teachers as well as for the intervention staff itself, that team that was running the behavior team meetings. Some of those individuals also had strong feelings that weren't necessarily positive about giving kids rewards and working that way with kids. So we were able to make some inroads with training, but it took more than just an understanding of what an FBA or a BIP were to get staff on board with using them. And that played an important role in the intervention menu. Often what we found was that the team as well as the teacher wanted everything to be built around kind of a bunch of small layers, because they were almost avoiding that big FBA because it was either a lot of work or they felt like it was going to be way too much reinforcement for what the teacher wanted to give out. So they wanted to build just a bunch of small layers for their reinforcement menu or their intervention menu. So they would say, well, let's have check and check out, and that doesn't necessarily have rewards built into it. Let's maybe have scheduled break times or maybe some small reward strategies. But then that kind of layering, what we found is that sometimes we were giving so many scheduled breaks and we were doing check and check out with so much strength that it almost was becoming Tier 3. And so we had to, as a team, start to recognize that sometimes Tier 3 wasn't so much doing a complete FBA, but it was also looking at those other elements around kids, looking at how many different small things we were doing. And so, well, what we had to do was help the team recognize that we were actually moving those kids on to Tier 3, even though they looked like they were just getting a bunch of Tier 2 plans. And then another thing that we frequently came up against was that idea of an in-school versus an outside-of-school intervention. And really what that boiled down to was an in-school intervention at Tier 3 would often be the FBA and doing the behavior intervention plan. But the outside interventions were things like working with outside mental health agencies, working with medical doctors. Oftentimes they involve medication for kids. And those are things that weren't necessarily Tier 3. Sometimes those happened in a much lower tier as well. And I think it kind of captures up that whole idea that we deal with in education as a whole, that how does that fit in with what it is that we're doing? How do we parse out what we're responsible for? And how do we deal with the fact that there are some kids that do have some needs that do fall within the medical realm? And so trying to make a sense of intervention plans that kind of were more comprehensive was one of the things that we started, and I think that we want to continue to keep building on as we keep working through these lessons that we've learned from NCII and keep moving forward. So overall, overall, we feel like we've made a lot of progress, and I think like a lot of schools out there, we can still see that there are some ways to go. So what we try to do is focus on individual kids and yet keep working with our process to make things improve that way. I think that's my last slide. Are there any questions?
Hi, Rod. Thank you so much for that. There are a couple of questions that have come in. One participant was wondering what graphing program you used.
I don't know where it originated from. We have, I'm pretty sure you can find it. We have this a state program in Michigan called, the acronym is MyBlissy, M-I-B-L-S-I, and I know that I got it from them probably sometime in the last 10 years. And it's really just a little short Excel program. I always call it the Beatles program because sort of the phony students that are in it are John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
Mm-hmm.
But if they were to Google MyBlissy, M-I-B-L-S-I, you could get to the MyBlissy website. And it's pretty well organized. I'm about 90% sure that it's actually probably still in there somewhere under check-in, check-out. And if not, I could probably send it to someone and they could send it out or make it part of what we talked about. Would that be possible?
Sure. Actually, if you share it with Amy, we can include that in the follow-up questions.
Oh,
a link to it in the follow-up questions. That would
great.
be great.
Yeah, I'll send that to Amy then. Yeah, it's just a little Excel program. It's so easy. Once you look into it, it's ridiculously simple to work with. But the graphing is really powerful out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, but we've also created a similar tool for the NCII website, and we are just about to post that one as well. I think we've just finished all the troubleshooting and making sure all the bugs are out, so that should be available very soon.
It's actually posted already, and I'm happy to include the link in the chat.
Okay, great. I know that just getting finalized in the last few days. So from Michael, and this is probably relevant for both Rod and Kim and also Amy, but in general, did you find that DBI implementation was more focused or successful in sites that also had behavior supports in place?
This is Kim. Absolutely. Because in many cases you needed that combination of supports to help students.
Great. And I would say, oh, go ahead, Brad.
I would agree with that 100%. I think that's why we went back within our one building and kind of revisited early on because we realized we didn't have the supports as well developed as we wanted. And so we started even going back to Tier 1 just to get that built in place to give us the ability to be more successful with Tier 3.
Yeah, and I think that, building on what both Kim and Rod have said, anecdotally across all of the sites that we've worked with, we found that often in doing this, when schools were attempting to do this implementation, it often pointed to needs in behavior. So even though many places didn't necessarily start with an implementation focus in behavior, as they got into doing intervention planning, it became very apparent to them students had a lot of avoidance behaviors and other kinds of disruptive behavior that may have been impacting their ability to profit academically. And then also more generally, the kinds of students they were seeing getting referred were often ones that had co-occurring behavior problems. And so they realized there was a need for a more structured behavior support system in place in school, not necessarily just at the Tier 3 level, but often it pointed to a need across the board. And so we definitely did see that in many places. Okay, so with that, we have a couple more questions, but again, they're more general, and I'm going to hold those till the end, and we're going to turn it over to Amy Peterson, who's going to represent the perspective of the TA staff from the center and some of the lessons learned that we have had.
Great. So I'm excited to be able to kind of add on to some of the lessons learned that Chris and Kim and Rod talked about already. So I'm going to keep these at a pretty high level and go through some of them, fairly quickly, because some of them are ones we've already talked about in a little bit of depth before, and I want to make sure that there is that time for questions at the end. So Nick, you can move on to the next slide. Just to back us up a second, I wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of who we were providing technical assistance to. And in addition to Michigan and Missouri, who you've heard some representatives from those two states, we also were providing support to Minnesota, and specifically in Minnesota, Minneapolis Public Schools, and then a couple of districts within Rhode Island as well. You can go on to the next one. So when we started thinking about our approach to TA, we noticed that things look a little bit different from when we initially were doing our technical assistance in our approach, and then as we worked through the technical assistance over time. So I wanted to share some of that history with you and that progression. Our initial approach really had all of our intensive TA sites really moving through that DBA training series that Chris mentioned at the beginning, and then we included follow-up coaching sessions and had a coach assigned to each of those schools that we were working with. We also developed district-level technical assistance plan that really aligned with kind of a district approach to implementing intensive intervention and looking at that DBI training series and some milestones for really getting that in place. One of the things that we noticed over time was that we needed to customize that a little bit more as we moved away from kind of the initial training with sites into the implementation, and kind of the contextual differences that each school was having really led us to develop individual school-level technical assistance plans rather than just rely on a district-level plan. So they were still couched within a larger district plan, but really had individual goals and activities related to each of the individual schools. We also had to be a little bit more flexible over time with the training and support that we provided, especially to the sites that came on later on. So we had, as Kim mentioned, a middle school both in Missouri as well as in Rhode Island that came on at a later date. We had some additional pilot sites that came on in different districts that were added in expansion zones. So those trainings looked a little bit different. Minneapolis also came on slightly later than some of the other training sites, and one of the things that we had to do when we were providing support in Minneapolis was really shift our trainings from originally they were developed as kind of a half-day training, but they didn't have the time in their schedule for that half-day time. So we really had to shorten those into hour-long sessions that happen more frequently to really meet with their professional learning needs. So just making some customizations and adaptations to that approach over time. We also introduced this, something called case examples that I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. But one of the other things that I wanted to talk about in our approach was around the coaching. And so Kim was, as we mentioned, one of the coaches that was really supporting work in Missouri, but our coaching looked a little bit different across our different sites, just depending on what was available in the different states and who we could rely on for coaching support. So we had coaches that were both embedded within the school district providing support. We also had external coaches. So we had coaches, for example, in Rhode Island that represented state level staff, as well as folks that provided support through an MTSS project through Rhode Island, and so that allowed us to kind of connect with that group and link into that group. But in other, some of the other sites, it was either folks that were related to universities, professors or graduate students or project staff at universities that were providing that coaching support. And as Rod mentioned, you know, in some situations it was someone coming from a distance, and so it was different strategies in different places to see how that coaching looked. But one of the big things that we noticed was how important the coaching was across all of the sites that we worked with. So if you want to go on to the next slide. This slide hits home a little bit of some of those pieces that we've talked about already. Starting small, really thinking about being strategic about the number of school sites that you take on originally. Also thinking about the specific content area. So we had a lot of sites that really targeted in perhaps first on reading, but then expanded into mathematics or behavior over time as they started to feel a little bit more confident with the process. And the other thing that we noticed, or we had sites really work on, is selecting a couple students to really solidify the process before extending to a huge, large group of students. When we're talking about intensive intervention, we're really talking about a targeted group of students anyway, and a pretty small group of students, but really thinking about getting the process down and getting facile with the process in order to help facilitate this more as we move forward. So the case studies that I mentioned on the previous slide, and you can see an example of what that looks like here on this sheet really helped the sites really dig into the process and really help them to document kind of what it looks like to provide DBI to an individual student, and really making sure that they've gotten the documentation down, that they've gotten the graphs down that they're developing for the individual students. They're noting the adaptations that they're making, that they're going back, as Kim mentioned, and checking in regularly enough so that we really make sure that we're not just developing a plan for a student and then not moving forward and not checking whether that's working for the student. So those case study forms really helped the schools to kind of solidify their processes and then expand to other students. And one of the things that we saw, even for the sites that we're selecting perhaps a couple students to start with, they were still embedding the learning that they were learning through the training series into supporting other students outside of the students that they might be providing case examples on. And then over the course of the project, you know, the first year they might have provided case example information for 1 or 2 students, and then the next year more students, so they were able to really grow that over time. All right, so the next slide. The next piece is really about customization and being flexible. I think one of the big lessons that we had to learn, or that we continue to learn, I think, and everyone who's on this call, I'm sure, really understands this challenge around language and people using different language to mean the same things or to mean slightly different things. One of the things that we were less concerned about was what people were calling the DBI process in their school sites. We had some sites that really adopted the language of DBI, and we had other sites that really talked about it as being their tier 3 or being intensive intervention. And we were less critical about what the language was than what were the essential components that were supporting that process. So if they were doing DBI and calling it tier 3, great. But we wanted to make sure that then when we were doing things like our implementation checks that Chris referenced, that we were being responsive to their language as well and not using language that didn't really fit with their context. So being careful about that, I think, is an important piece. We also saw that they really need to customize the tools and resources that we provided. So some folks talked about the different data meeting tools and really making them their own. We had some sites that really needed to adapt data meeting processes, and we had others that had some pretty strong processes in place. And so instead of starting from scratch, they really used those the data meeting tools as kind of checks to see whether or not they were collecting the right kind of information or if they needed to think about that slightly differently. So for example, in Minneapolis, they have a data system that really asks a lot of the questions that we were already asking on the data meeting forms. We weren't asking the Minneapolis schools we were working with to then use a separate form in order to do the work with us. We wanted them to use the platform that they had in place. But we wanted to make sure that they were getting the right information in that platform, and they, instead of focusing on kind of creating a new product or a new tool, they were really focused on making sure that the tool that they had in place was being used and being used appropriately. So really thinking about kind of that fidelity piece there. In addition, really being flexible with the training. So we had to think about some creative means to share the training content, as I mentioned before, as well as revisiting training elements as sites progress. So sites might have initially had some training on something and then said, oh, we have a lot of new staff, we need a retraining, or we're still really struggling to grasp this content, we need a retraining, and being really responsive to that was important as well. You can go on next. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these essential elements and flexibility within implementation because we have talked about this on some other of our webinars previously, but this has been a really important part for us as solidifying what we really saw as essential as part of the DBI process, and it really led to some other pieces of work as well. So our initial and it really came from the work of the coaches we were working with, as well as the school sites and our lessons learned from implementing with them. So we really started to lay out kind of what were some of the really essential pieces that needed to be in place, and where was there flexibility in those pieces. So we're not going to tell you which progress monitoring tool you need to use, but we're going to say we really need you to be collecting progress monitoring data using a valid and reliable tool, graphing that data, and collecting it regularly enough to make decisions. So really thinking about kind of where is the flexibility and where are those essential elements that really need to be in place in order for this to actually be happening. You can go on next. So this is just an example of those pulse check implementation data forms that we were talking about, and they're available on the website, along with some additional fidelity tools that look at the process at the meeting level or at the individual implementation of a plan level that might be helpful for folks. But we really found the formative implementation data helpful both to drive our technical assistance planning, as Chris mentioned, but also for sites to really reflect on where they are in the process and where their goals are for implementation in the future, and really thinking about kind of what's going well and what challenges are arising. It both allowed us to make changes as well as them to make changes at the school level. So Nick, you can go on. We talked a lot about this already in the webinar, but I wanted to reference a great video that's up there from one of the district administrators in Swartz Creek, Michigan, who talked about the importance of having a plan, a systemic approach for the implementation of intensive intervention and embedding that within their larger MTSS plan. And I think Chris referenced that as an important feature that had been found through their analysis as well. So it's really important to really think systematically as you're developing kind of this work, and how does DBI fit within the other work that's going on at the school level, at the district level, and so on. So you can go on. Again, this importance of leadership really came throughout our technical assistance. We found sites that had supportive leaders really much stronger and much more able to get things going and get things sustained over time compared to the sites that didn't have that strong leadership level. So it was important for commitment, reinforcing buy-in as well as readiness. And we also saw, as other folks have mentioned, that leadership differs from site to site. There were some sites that had the principal at a school within each of the data meetings that they were having on individual students. There were other sites that really had instructors or administrators empower other folks in the school or the district in order to support that. So it definitely did look different, but it was really an essential piece for us to be able to move forward with sites, as well as sites to be successful in their implementation. You can go to the next one. And this is something that Rod just mentioned as well as Rebecca, but that importance of intersecting in the intersection between academics and behavior. And I think it came to the forefront for a lot of the sites as they were working with individual students and really trying to understand the individual needs of those students. They noticed that interplay between academics and behavior, and I think it's an important point to continue to think about as you're thinking about what are the individual needs of the student. Are there behavioral aspects that are influencing the academics or vice versa? So really thinking about breaking that down and looking at that individual student level was really important. All right, and just, you know, as a reinforcement, and this was something that Chris said as well, but that importance to be relentless. There's a lot of hard work that's going on within the implementation of intensive intervention across the school sites at the individual student level and teachers working with individual students, as well as expanding up to implementing at the school level, at the district level, and so on. So it's really important to really think about this is a process. It's a learning process. It's a formative learning process, and there's always room for improvement and to really get that process in place. So I know we're running out of time, but we just wanted to share a little bit about the new center before we ended today. So you can flip to the next one, actually. So as Rebecca mentioned at the start of this webinar, we recently just won a recompete of the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which we're really excited about. It will look a little bit different going forward compared to what we looked like in the past 5 years, and some shifts are up here on the slide here. So we're really focusing again on that importance of academic and behavioral integration, thinking about identification and intervention for culturally and linguistically diverse students, really thinking about what are the needs of English language learners within this process. We're shifting away from looking specifically at the school and local level to also embed a little bit more of a focus on the SEA level or the state level and supporting states to help their schools and districts to implement intensive intervention. And in that vein, we'll be connecting in with the results-driven accountability and state systemic improvement plan work that many of you are probably aware of. We'll also be extending our work to IHEs to really help teacher prep programs, and then continuing to leverage opportunities for collaboration and targeting new audiences as we move forward. So the next couple slides really just break that down a little bit more. So what will it look like perhaps in the next 5 years? And stay tuned, I think, is the big key takeaway for this work. We'll be coming out with additional information about what the new center looks like, how you might be able to get support, or if you're a state level folks, how you might be able to connect in with us for the next 5 years of the center. So definitely stay tuned. If you're not already on our mailing list, definitely join, come back to our website. We'll have additional information coming out about what the next 5 years of the center will actually look like as well. All right.
Great.
I just
Thank
also,
you.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No problem. We just wanted to put a plug in for another upcoming webinar that we're having in October. It's part of the Disability Awareness Month, and focusing on work that we're doing here through the NCII, as well as work through an IES-funded project that really looked at research around implementation of, research of intensive intervention. So definitely an exciting opportunity. That will be October 17th at 2 p.m. and additional information on that one will be coming out shortly as well. All right, go ahead, Rebecca.
Great, thank you, Amy. So with that, we are just about we're actually a little bit past our time, so we'll just get to these last couple of questions that have come in, and then we will sign off. First, Mark asked if any of the students that were participated in received intensive intervention services in your schools were students that were considered low incidence with high needs, or perhaps who are pre-linguistic learners or without any formal communication skills, or formal means of communication, I should say. So Rod or Kim, in your experience, did any of your students who received intensive intervention fall into any of those categories?
In our building, none of them did. We had some students that were on IEPs, but none of them would have been low incident.
In my building, not super low incidence. We did have some students who, because of the intensity of their behaviors, maybe they were students with autism, or maybe their reading skills were so delayed that they wouldn't really fit into our Tier 3 group, even with a special education teacher in the room to support them. We did do some pull-out for some students. Our English language learner students, because we would have them coming in all the time, some of them with very limited English proficiency, we would typically put them into our Tier 3 reading groups, but they would also get supplemental English language instruction outside of that reading block too.
Great, thank you. And more generally, oh, yep.
Can I just add one point? So this is Chris. I do reading research with students with intellectual disability, and I will just say that I have successfully used the DBI process with that population of students. So although they might not always be incorporated into an MTS or RTI system, the DBI process itself is still very applicable for many of our students with intellectual disability.
Thank you, Chris. I'm glad you said that. Some of the schools we worked with did have teachers on the intervention teams who did teach self-contained and classes and worked with kids with more significant disabilities. And we also do have some of our resources on our website that do address some of the needs of students who fall into that population or who have alternative communication needs, though it was not a primary focus. We also had a couple of questions from Dean. Number one was a question about how many, it's actually less a webinar, but just how was fidelity assessed, and then how many schools did we work with? And so again, we worked with, over the course of the project, about 26 schools. On a couple of related projects, there are about 12 more that we've worked with using NCII materials and the framework of the DBI process. But, and then also with respect to his other question, this might be one that we can speak to more generally, which is about fidelity and how is it assessed. One of the things that we did as a center was we have an implementation rubric that actually defines what full, partial, and minimal implementation looks like. And we did do a structured interview process with folks in the schools that using an individual who was affiliated with the center but who didn't work directly with those schools, and then also with the school coach, where they interviewed the school team about their implementation and asked for specific pieces of information and artifacts related to implementation to get a sense of the level of implementation fidelity of the broader system. We also asked questions and encouraged sites to evaluate fidelity of the delivery of interventions and of their assessment procedures, though we did find that those were done with kind of variable levels of implementation fidelity. And then finally, we've developed some materials related to a monitoring fidelity of the implementation of the DBI process for an individual student. So when you get to the point of adapting an intervention, that may not be something where you're following a script within a particular intervention program, or where the process is or manualized or scripted out for you. So it may be that there are different components of the plan that you're actually having to follow. So that in those cases, fidelity would really be, did you adhere to your plan? And we've created a series of checklists and tracking tools for teachers and intervention teams to use to monitor that as well. And we can provide a link to that in our in the chat box, and also as a transcript, as part of the transcript for the webinar.
And I actually just posted that link to the fidelity resources for everyone in the chat box. So that's the page that houses all of the fidelity resources, and you'll find both the rubric as well as those other tools that Rebecca just noted.
Great. Well, we are a few minutes over, but I think we managed to answer all the questions that came into the chat box. They were excellent questions, so thank you for asking them, and thank you for sticking with us through this webinar. And also many thanks to our panelists for the great information they presented. We look forward to working with you in the next 5 years.